The woodpile behind Ingrid Halverson's homestead stretched 40 feet long, 12 feet high, and 8 feet deep. It was not a woodpile. It was a monument, a fortress of split oak and ash and maple that had taken 5 years to build and represented more fuel than any family could burn in a decade. The logs were stacked with the precision of a mason laying stone, each piece fitted against its neighbors, the whole structure covered with a roof of salvaged tin to keep the snow and rain from reaching the wood beneath. The people of Redwater, Minnesota, had been laughing at that woodpile since its 3rd year. They had called it the widow's folly. They had joked that Ingrid Halverson must be planning to heat the entire territory, or perhaps she was building a wooden cathedral to worship at on cold winter mornings. The woodpile had become a local landmark, a story told to visitors about the crazy Norwegian widow who spent every spare moment splitting and stacking logs for fires she would never need. Now, in the 3rd week of January 1881, with temperatures at 42 degrees below zero and snow drifting higher than rooftops, the laughter had stopped. The blizzard had arrived on January 12th and had not relented for 9 days. 9 days of howling wind that drove snow horizontally through the air, that piled drifts 30 feet high against any obstacle, that made travel between buildings impossible and travel between homesteads suicidal. The cold that accompanied the blizzard was not ordinary winter cold. It was the kind of cold that killed exposed flesh in minutes, that froze water before it could hit the ground, that cracked iron and shattered glass and drove men mad with its relentless assault. The woodpiles of Redwater's families, the ordinary woodpiles, the sensible woodpiles, the piles that represented a winter's worth of fuel and no more, had been exhausted by the 5th day. The blizzard continued, the cold intensified, and the families who had mocked Ingrid Halverson's excess now faced a choice between freezing in their homes and venturing into a white hell that would kill them before they reached any source of salvation. Except one source remained. Ingrid had seen what was coming. She had lived through winters in Norway that had killed entire villages, had watched her own grandmother freeze to death because there was not enough wood to keep the fire burning through a storm that lasted longer than anyone had prepared for. She had come to Minnesota knowing that the northern winters here were just as deadly, that the same fate awaited anyone who trusted in modest preparation against immodest cold. So she had stacked and stacked and stacked. Now, with the blizzard still raging and her neighbors dying in houses gone cold, Ingrid Halverson loaded wood onto the sled she had built for exactly this purpose, harnessed her draft horse Björn to the traces, and began the impossible journey to save people who had laughed at her for 5 years. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the frozen north, the mountain country, or somewhere the cold cuts just as deep. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the only warmth left comes from the woodpile they mocked. Ingrid had arrived in Minnesota in the spring of 1874, following her husband Eric across an ocean and half a continent to claim land that the government was giving away to anyone brave or desperate enough to work it. They had been married 3 years by then, had lost one child to fever in Norway, and had decided that America offered better chances than the hardscrabble farming that was all their homeland could provide. Eric had been a woodcutter in the old country, a man who understood trees and axes and the patient labor of turning standing timber into useful fuel. He had looked at the forests of Minnesota and seen not wilderness but wealth, not obstacles but opportunity. The trees that other settlers cursed as impediments to farming, he welcomed as the raw material for survival. "Wood is life," he told Ingrid during their first autumn on the claim, as they worked side by side to fill the small woodshed he had built. "In Norway, people die every winter because there is not enough wood to burn. Here, the trees grow faster than any man can cut them. We will never be cold if we are not lazy." They had stacked wood that first year, more than they needed, Eric insisted, because you never knew when winter would overstay its welcome. They had stacked more the second year and more the third, building a reserve that other settlers thought excessive, but that Eric considered merely prudent. He had died in the fourth year, killed by a falling tree that he had misjudged, crushed beneath a trunk that weighed more than a dozen men. Ingrid had found him at the edge of the clearing, his axe still in his hand, his eyes open to the gray November sky. She had buried him on the ridge above their cabin. In a grave she dug herself through soil that was already beginning to freeze. She had been alone ever since. Alone, but not helpless. Eric had taught her everything he knew about trees and axes and the calculation of how much wood a winter required. She had continued his practice, expanded it, made the woodpile her monument to his memory and her insurance against the fate that had claimed her grandmother in a cold Norwegian cabin 40 years before. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. The people of Redwater had not understood her project, and they had made their incomprehension clear. Gunnar Lindqvist was the closest thing Redwater had to a community leader, a Swedish immigrant who had arrived 5 years before the Halversons and who had established the general store that served as the social center of the scattered settlement. He was a practical man, or so he believed, and practical men did not waste years building wood piles that would rot before they could be burned. "The widow Halverson is touched by grief," Lindqvist announced at his store one winter afternoon, where the settlers gathered to purchase supplies and exchange gossip. "She spends more time with her axe than with her neighbors. That woodpile of hers must hold 20 years of fuel by now. What does she think is coming? An ice age?" The laughter had rippled through the store, the easy cruelty of people who needed someone to feel superior to. Martha Lindqvist, Gunnar's wife, had added her own assessment. "The poor woman has no children, no husband, no purpose. The woodpile gives her something to do. We should pity her, not mock her." The pity was somehow worse than the mockery. Ingrid heard the comments. Sound traveled far in a sparse community, and gossip traveled farther. She heard herself called the woodpile widow, heard her years of labor dismissed as the busy work of a grief-addled mind, heard the laughter that followed any mention of her name. She continued stacking. By 1879, the woodpile had grown beyond anything Redwater had ever seen. Ingrid had expanded the original structure twice, adding wings that extended the length and depth, building a proper roof to protect the wood from moisture, creating what amounted to a wooden warehouse behind her modest cabin. She had developed a system, oldest wood on one end, newest on the other, rotating the supply so that nothing sat long enough to rot. She had also expanded her cutting operation. Where Eric had cleared a few acres, she had cleared a dozen, methodically working through the timber on her claim, transforming standing forest into split fuel. Her arms had grown strong from the constant swinging, her hands calloused into leather, her body shaped by labor that would have broken many men. The winter of 1880 to 81 began early and showed its teeth immediately. The first blizzard struck in October, killing livestock caught in the open and burying the late harvest under snow that would not melt until April. The cold that followed was deeper than anyone remembered. Sustained temperatures of 20, 30, 40 below zero, punctuated by brief warmings that only made the next cold snap more bitter. By December, the woodpiles of Redwater's families were shrinking faster than anyone had anticipated. The cold demanded constant fire, constant fuel, constant attention to the stoves that were the only thing standing between life and death. Men made extra trips to the woodlots, cutting green timber that burned poorly and smoked terribly, but was better than nothing. They looked at the winter stretching ahead and began to worry. Ingrid looked at her woodpile, still massive, barely touched, enough fuel for years, and felt the grim satisfaction of someone whose warnings had been correct. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The Great Blizzard arrived on January 12th, 1881, and it was unlike anything the settlers of Minnesota had ever experienced. The storm came from the northwest, a wall of white that swallowed the landscape in minutes. One moment the sky was gray but visible. The next, the world had disappeared into a howling void of wind-driven snow that reduced visibility to inches. The temperature, already brutal, plunged further as the blizzard intensified, the wind chill reaching levels that no thermometer could measure because no thermometer had been designed for such conditions. The blizzard did not stop. Day after day, the wind screamed and the snow fell, and the cold pressed down on the land like a physical weight. The drifts grew higher, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet, burying fences and sheds and anything that stood in their path. The trails between homesteads disappeared entirely, replaced by a trackless white wilderness that looked the same in every direction. By the third day, families were rationing wood. By the fifth day, many had run out entirely. The Lindqvist store had been the community gathering point, but Gunnar had not stockpiled fuel any more carefully than his neighbors. His woodpile was exhausted by the sixth day, and the merchandise in his store offered nothing that could burn hot enough to keep the building warm. He began breaking apart shelving units, feeding the carefully constructed furniture into his stove piece by piece. The Erickson family, half a mile from the Lindqvists, ran out of wood on the fourth day. They burned their table and chairs on the fifth day, their bed frames on the sixth. By the seventh day, they had nothing left but the walls of their cabin, and they understood with terrible clarity that they could not burn their house and shelter inside it at the same time. Similar scenes played out across Redwater. The Petersons, the Andersons, the Johnsons and the Carlsons and the Swensons, all the families who had built their homes and lived their lives and stacked their sensible woodpiles without ever imagining a winter that would devour everything they had prepared. The first death came on January 18th. Old man Bergstrom, who had lived alone on the edge of the settlement and whose fire had gone out sometime in the night. They would not find his body until spring, frozen solid in his bed, his stove cold, his woodpile buried under a drift that had swallowed his entire cabin. The second death followed hours later. Then the third. The blizzard was killing Redwater, and there was nothing anyone could do. Except Ingrid Halvorsen still had wood. She had calculated, during the early days of the storm, exactly what was happening to her neighbors. She knew how much wood a cabin required in extreme cold. More than people thought, far more than the modest piles that most families maintained. She knew that the blizzard would outlast their supplies. She knew that people would begin to die. On the morning of January 19th, with the blizzard still raging but slightly diminished from its worst fury, she made her decision. The journey to the Lindqvist store, the central point from which help could be distributed, was half a mile. In normal winter conditions, she could walk it in 15 minutes. In the current conditions, with drifts higher than her head and wind that threatened to knock her down with every step, it took her 3 hours. She did not walk, she drove. Björn was a Norwegian fjord horse, a breed developed over centuries for exactly these conditions. He was small but immensely strong, capable of pulling loads that would stagger larger horses, and he was utterly calm in weather that would panic other animals. Ingrid had harnessed him to the sledge she used for hauling wood, had loaded it with as much split oak as the sledge could carry, and had set out into the white void. The journey was a nightmare of cold and wind, and the constant threat of losing her way in a landscape that had no landmarks. She navigated by compass and instinct, by the feel of the ground beneath Björn's hooves, by the occasional glimpse of a fence post or tree trunk that told her she was still on course. The wind screamed around her, driving snow into every gap in her clothing, freezing her eyelashes together, threatening to steal her breath with every gust. She reached the Lindqvist store at noon, more dead than alive, her eyebrows white with frost and her fingers numb inside 3 pairs of mittens. Gunnar Lindqvist opened the door to find the woodpile widow standing in the snow with a sledge full of firewood behind her, the horse that had pulled it steaming in the cold, the impossible having become suddenly real. "I have wood," Ingrid said simply. "More than we can use in 10 winters. Load what you need. I will bring more." She made 7 trips over the next 4 days. 7 trips through conditions that should have killed her, that had already killed 3 of her neighbors, that would kill 7 more before the blizzard finally broke. She hauled wood to the Lindqvist store, to the Eriksson cabin, to any family that she could reach before their fires died entirely. Björn pulled until his legs trembled with exhaustion, rested for hours in whatever shelter was available, then pulled again. The wood from her 5-year stockpile, the monument they had mocked, the folly they had laughed at, became the only fuel keeping 40 people alive. The Peterson children, 5 of them under the age of 10, survived because Ingrid brought wood to their cabin on the 2nd day of her rescue operation. Their father had already begun dismantling the walls when she arrived. The elderly Swenson couple, both in their 70s, survived because Ingrid's wood burned in the Lindqvist store, where they had taken shelter after their own cabin became uninhabitable. Martha Lindqvist, who had pitied the poor grief-addled widow with her useless woodpile, survived because that woodpile was the only source of warmth for 50 miles. 40 souls. 40 people who would have frozen in the homes they had built, surrounded by land that was supposed to give them prosperity, killed by a winter that no one had adequately prepared for. Except one woman had prepared, and that preparation saved them all. The blizzard broke on January 21st, replaced by clear skies and temperatures that remained brutal but at least permitted movement. The survivors of Redwater emerged from their shelters into a landscape transformed. Drifts as high as rooftops, buildings buried to their eaves, a white wilderness where their community had been. They emerged because they were alive. They emerged because a widow with a woodpile had refused to let them die. The gathering came in March, when the snow had retreated enough to permit travel, and the survivors could assess what had happened. They assembled at the Lindqvist store, repaired now, restocked with the charity supplies that had arrived from St. Paul, to reckon with the winter that had nearly killed them all. Gunnar Lindqvist spoke first. The man who had called Ingrid's woodpile the work of a grief-addled mind now stood before his community with the humility of someone whose certainty had nearly cost 40 lives. "I laughed at Ingrid Halvorsen," he said, his voice thick with shame. "For 5 years I watched her stack wood, and I laughed. I called it foolish. I called it the obsession of a woman too broken by grief to know when to stop. I was so certain that I knew better than a widow who had lost everything except her determination to prepare." He stopped, struggling to continue. "My store would have become our tomb. My family would have frozen beside me. Every person in this room would be dead if Ingrid had not spent 5 years building a woodpile that I spent 5 years mocking. I do not know how to apologize for being so wrong about something so important." Martha Lindqvist spoke next. The woman who had offered pity instead of respect, who had condescended to the widow she should have learned from, wept openly as she confessed. "I said she had no purpose. I said the woodpile was her way of coping with a life that had nothing left in it. I was cruel, and I was stupid, and I am alive because the woman I pitied was stronger and smarter than I ever imagined." Others spoke. The Petersons, whose children had been hours from freezing when Ingrid arrived. The Swensons, whose old bones would have been found stiff and cold in a cabin gone dark. The families who had watched their sensible woodpiles vanish in the endless cold, who had understood too late that sensible was not enough. When the testimonies were complete, Ingrid rose from her seat at the back of the gathering. She was still thin from the exertion of those 7 trips, still recovering from the cold that had crept into her bones despite her preparation. But her eyes were clear, and her voice was steady. "In Norway," she began, "my grandmother froze to death in a storm that lasted longer than anyone expected. She was found in her cabin with her stove cold and her woodpile empty. She had prepared for a normal winter, and the winter that came was not normal." She looked around at the faces of those she had saved. "My husband Eric taught me that wood is life. He taught me that you cannot know how long a winter will last or how cold it will become. He taught me that the only safe amount of fuel is more than you can imagine needing, because your imagination will fail you before the winter will." She paused. "I did not stack that wood because I was broken. I did not stack it because I had no purpose. I stacked it because I understood something that you did not, that the cold does not care about your plans, your expectations, or your certainty that you have prepared enough. The cold will take everything you have and demand more, and if you cannot provide it, you will die." She looked at Gunnar Lindqvist. "You laughed because you could not imagine needing what I built. Now you know. Now you have seen a winter that consumed everything you prepared and demanded more. The question is what you will do with that knowledge." She turned and walked toward the door, then stopped. "There is still wood in my pile, more than I can burn in 5 years, even after what I gave this winter. Anyone who wants to learn how I built it, how I calculated how much to store, how I protected it from the weather, I will teach you. The knowledge is worth more than the wood." Thank you for watching this story about Ingrid Halvorsen and the woodpile of Redwater. When we mock preparation, we sometimes find ourselves dependent on those we ridiculed. If this story reminded you that the only safe amount is more than you can imagine needing, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever laughed at your preparations until they needed exactly what you had stored? That summer, the woodpiles of Redwater transformed. Every family that had survived the winter built storage for 3 times what they had previously considered adequate. They cut timber through the warm months, split and stacked and covered and stored, creating reserves that their former selves would have called absurd. Ingred taught them. She showed them how to calculate fuel consumption for the coldest possible conditions, not the average ones. She demonstrated the stacking techniques that kept wood dry and accessible. She explained the rotation system that prevented rot. The knowledge that Eric had passed to her, that her grandmother's death had made necessary, spread through the community and beyond. The phrase "building a Halverson" entered the vocabulary of the Minnesota frontier. It meant preparing beyond what seemed reasonable, stockpiling against disasters that might never come, trusting the knowledge of those who had seen what the worst could do. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about survival that could only be learned through nearly freezing to death. Ingred Halverson lived on her homestead for another 37 years, passing in the spring of 1918 at the age of 73. She never remarried. Eric had been her only love, but she was never alone. The community that had mocked her became a community that honored her, and the children she had saved grew up knowing that the quiet widow on the ridge had kept them alive when nothing else could. Her woodpile stood for decades after her death, maintained by neighbors who understood what it represented. When the homestead was finally abandoned in the 1940s, they took photographs of the structure, the tin roof, the careful stacking, the sheer improbable scale of what one woman had built with an axe and a determination that would not yield. Above the entrance to the woodshed, carved in letters that Ingrid added in the years after the Great Blizzard, is an inscription in both Norwegian and English. Ved er liv, wood is life. Her husband Eric, who had taught her those words before the falling tree took him, would have recognized the truth in them and smiled to know how many lives that truth had saved.